charges which might be brought against him had to do with infringements of the Jewish ecclesiastical laws. Therefore he sought to refer the case back to their own tribunal. Again, Pilate took delight in making them publicly confess that they were powerless to pronounce and execute the death sentence upon even one of their own race, whom they had come to despise with a bitter and envious hatred. It was a few hours previously, shortly before midnight, and after he had granted permission to use Roman soldiers in effecting the secret arrest of Jesus, that Pilate had heard further concerning Jesus and his teaching from his wife Claudia, who was a partial convert to Judaism, and who later on became a full-fledged believer in Jesus' gospel. Pilate would have liked to postpone this hearing, but he saw the Jewish leaders were determined to proceed with the case. He knew that this was not only the forenoon of the preparation for the Passover, but that this day, being Friday, was also the preparation day for the Jewish Sabbath of rest and worship. Pilate, being keenly sensitive to the disrespectful manner of the approach of these Jews, was not willing to comply with their demands that Jesus be sentenced to death without a trial. When, therefore, he had waited a few moments for them to present their charges against the prisoner, he turned to them and said, "I will not sentence this man to death without a trial, neither will I consent to examine him until you have presented your charges against him in writing." When the high priest and the others heard Pilate say this, they signaled to the clerk of the court, who handed to Pilate the written charges against Jesus, and these charges were: We find in the Sanhedrin tribunal that this man is an evildoer and a disturber of our nation, in that he is guilty of 1. Perverting our nation and stirring up our people to rebellion. 2. Forbidding the people to pay tribute to Caesar. 3. Calling himself the King of the Jews and teaching the founding of a new kingdom. Jesus had not been regularly tried nor legally convicted on any of these charges. He did not even hear these charges when first stated, but Pilate had him brought from the praetorium, where he was in the keeping of the guards, and he insisted that these charges be repeated in Jesus' hearing. When Jesus heard these accusations, he well knew that he had not been heard on these matters before the Jewish court, and so did John Zebedee and his accusers, but he made no reply to their false charges. Even when Pilate bade him answer his accusers, he opened not his mouth. Pilate was so astonished at the unfairness of the whole proceeding, and so impressed by Jesus' silent and masterly bearing, that he decided to take the prisoner inside the hall and examine him privately. Pilate was confused in mind, fearful of the Jews in his heart, and mightily stirred in his spirit by the spectacle of Jesus standing there in majesty before his bloodthirsty accusers, and gazing down on them, not in silent contempt, but with an expression of genuine pity and sorrowful affection. 3. The private examination by Pilate. Pilate took Jesus and John Zebedee into a private chamber, leaving the guards outside in the hall, and requesting the prisoner to sit down, he sat down by his side and asked several questions. Pilate began his talk with Jesus by assuring him that he did not believe the first count against him, that he was a perverter of the nation and an inciter to rebellion. Then he asked, "Did you ever teach that tribute should be refused Caesar?" Jesus, pointing to John, said, "Ask him or any other man who has heard my teaching." Then Pilate questioned John about this matter of tribute, and John testified concerning his master's teaching and explained that Jesus and his apostles paid taxes both to Caesar and to the temple. When Pilate had questioned John, he said, "See that you tell no man that I talked with you." And John never did reveal this matter. Pilate then turned around to question Jesus further, saying, "And now about the third accusation against you. Are you the King of the Jews?" Since there was a tone of possibly sincere inquiry in Pilate's voice, Jesus smiled on the procurator and said, "Pilate, do you ask this for yourself, or do you take this question from these others, my accusers?" Whereupon, in a tone of partial indignation, the governor answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own people and the chief priests delivered you up and asked me to sentence you to death. I question the validity of their charges, and am only trying to find out for myself what you have done. Tell me, have you said that you are the King of the Jews, and have you sought to found a new kingdom?" Then said Jesus to Pilate, "Do you not perceive that my kingdom is not of this world? If my kingdom were of this world, surely would my disciples fight that I should not be delivered into the hands of the Jews. My presence here before you in these bonds is sufficient to show all men that my kingdom is a spiritual dominion, even the brotherhood of all men who, through faith and by love, have become the sons of God. And this salvation is for the Gentile as well as for the Jew. Then you are a king after all, said Pilate. And Jesus answered, Yes, I am such a king, and my kingdom is the family of the faith sons of my Father who is in heaven. For this purpose was I born into this world, even that I should show my Father to all men, and bear witness to the truth of God. And even now do I declare to you that everyone who loves the truth hears my voice. Then said Pilate, half in ridicule and half in sincerity, Truth, what is truth? Who knows? Pilate was not able to fathom Jesus' words, nor was he able to understand the nature of his spiritual kingdom. But he was now certain that the prisoner had done nothing worthy of death. One look at Jesus face to face was enough to convince even Pilate that this gentle and weary, but majestic and upright man was no wild and dangerous revolutionary who aspired to establish himself on the temporal throne of Israel. Pilate thought he understood something of what Jesus meant when he called himself a king, for he was familiar with the teachings of the Stoics, who declared that the wise man is king. Pilate was thoroughly convinced that, instead of being a dangerous sedition-monger, Jesus was nothing more or less than a harmless visionary, an innocent fanatic. After questioning the Master, Pilate went back to the chief priests and the accusers of Jesus and said, I have examined this man, and I find no fault in him. I do not think he is guilty of the charges you have made against him. I think he ought to be set free. And when the Jews heard this, they were moved with great anger, so much so that they wildly shouted that Jesus should die, and one of the Sanhedrists boldly stepped up by the side of Pilate, saying, This man stirs up the people, beginning in Galilee and continuing throughout all Judea. He is a mischief-maker and an evil-doer. You will long regret it if you let this wicked man go free. Pilate was hard-pressed to know what to do with Jesus. Therefore, when he heard them say that he began his work in Galilee, he thought to avoid the responsibility of deciding the case, at least to gain time for thought, by sending Jesus to appear before Herod, who was then in the city attending the Passover. Pilate also thought that this gesture would help to antidote some of the bitter feeling which had existed for some time between himself and Herod, due to numerous misunderstandings over matters of jurisdiction. Pilate, calling the guards, said, This man is a Galilean. Take him forthwith to Herod, and when he has examined him, report his findings to me. And they took Jesus to Herod. 4. Jesus before Herod. When Herod Antipas stopped in Jerusalem, he dwelt in the old Maccabean palace of Herod the Great, and it was to this home of the former king that Jesus was now taken by the temple guards, and he was followed by his accusers and an increasing multitude. Herod had long heard of Jesus, and he was very curious about him. When the Son of Man stood before him on this Friday morning, the wicked Idumean never for one moment recalled the lad of former years who had appeared before him in Sepphoris, pleading for a just decision regarding the money to his father, who had been accidentally killed while at work on one of the public buildings. As far as Herod knew, he had never seen Jesus, although he had worried a great deal about him when his work had been centered in Galilee. Now that he was in custody of Pilate and the Judeans, Herod was desirous of seeing him, feeling secure against any trouble from him in the future. Herod had heard much about the miracles wrought by Jesus, and he really hoped to see him do some wonder. When they brought Jesus before Herod, the Tetrarch was startled by his stately appearance and the calm composure of his countenance. For some 15 minutes Herod asked Jesus questions, but the Master would not answer. Herod taunted and dared him to perform a miracle, but Jesus would not reply to his many inquiries or respond to his taunts. Then Herod turned to the chief priests and the Sadducees, and, giving ear to their accusations, heard all and more than Pilate had listened to regarding the alleged evil doings of the Son of Man. Finally, being convinced that Jesus would neither talk nor perform a wonder for him, Herod, after making fun of him for a time, arrayed him in an old purple royal robe and sent him back to Pilate. Herod knew he had no jurisdiction over Jesus in Judea. Though he was glad to believe that he was finally to be rid of Jesus in Galilee, he was thankful